Are you craving that soft, buttery, slightly charred naan that you normally only get at a restaurant? This homemade naan bread recipe is so simple to make. It's flexible, it's soft, it's light, and the best part is that this flatbread can easily be made at home. This naan recipe uses simple ingredients that you probably already have in your pantry. It is a recipe that uses yeast, so we will need to activate the yeast and make sure that it is alive before we actually move on to mixing the dough. I have a cup of warm water here. Now I use well water, but if you use city water that is chlorinated, I recommend leaving the water out on the counter for a couple hours before you mix the yeast into it. Sometimes chlorine can have a bad reaction with the yeast, and then it won't rise properly and, turn out how it should. To the water, I added some honey. Honey will help speed up the process and activate the yeast because yeast eats sugar. I quickly mix this together and then I will set it aside. It will start to foam, and once that happens, I know that the yeast is ready and alive and I can use it in the dough. So as I wait for that to happen, I am going to get my flour and the rest of the ingredients. I have the exact recipe in the description below, so you can get all accurate measurements there. I am not being super accurate with my cups of flour here. I am just eyeing it. When it comes to making any sort of dough, even flatbread dough, what's more important is becoming familiar with the texture that you want to achieve rather than making sure that all the measurements are completely accurate. So when we go ahead and give it a quick knead later on, we will look at the texture and see if we need to add more flour. So I do always try to err on the side of less flour than more because it's easy to add more flour if need be. I added some baking powder there. That will really help it rise and puff up and you get those nice bubbles later on that we want to see in our naan. I quickly give these dry ingredients a stir before I start adding the wet ingredients. The water, honey, and yeast mixture has foamed up nicely, so I will add that to the bowl. I'm also adding 1 egg. This egg was at room temperature. Even depending on the size of your egg, it will have an effect on the amount of flour that you need. So that's why I say to really look at the texture once we put the dough all together and knead it, rather than being super precise with the measurements. I'm adding some high-fat yogurt here. I recommend using something thick and creamy. Once all the wet ingredients have been added to the bowl, it's time to mix it together. I'm using a Danish whisk here. I find it the easiest tool to use in the kitchen when I am making a dough. It doesn't get all the little dough bits stuck in it. I did realize that I totally forgot to add some salt, so luckily I did not move on from here and I made sure to add my salt in. I know I'll be kneading this dough, so I'll be able to thoroughly mix it in, but I would recommend you add the salt when you put the flour and the baking soda in the bowl. Add it to the dry ingredients. So I'm going to give it a quick whisk, and it's a very wet dough right now at this point. I know I'm going to have to be adding more flour to it. I lightly dusted my counter with some flour, and I will work that flour into the dough. I want to put a bit more flour in this dough, but I don't want to use more than necessary because I want it to remain light and fluffy. As I knead it, it'll become a lot softer and smoother. This isn't a recipe where I need to knead the dough for a long time, but I do need to make sure that it's nice and soft and not sticking to everything, and that when I poke down on it, it fluffs back up quickly. So I'm going to work at it a little bit here, and then I'm going to shape it into a ball. It's a pretty easy process to knead, and it really familiarizes you with dough. So I do recommend trying to do this by hand, just so you can get comfortable and familiar with the final texture. So as you can see here, it's kind of sticking to my counter. What I do when that happens is I'll add a bit more flour. I keep going back to my flour jar and just sprinkling a bit more on top. But I do it slowly because I really don't want to add too much flour, because then my dough will become too dry, which then would cause it to take too long to rise, or it would result in a really dense bread. Here I'm kneading the dough. I'm just pressing my palm down on the dough and I'm turning it as I do so. I find this to be a really relaxing process, and I enjoy kneading doughs, but not too much. So if it's a recipe where it needs to be kneaded for say 10 minutes, then I'll use my KitchenAid. But this was just a quick knead to get it to all stick together and be soft. And then I pressed down on it and it sprung back quickly. So I knew it was ready. I am using some avocado oil in the bowl and on top of the bread just so it doesn't dry out or stick to the bowl. I plop it into the bowl and I will cover it with some saran wrap. I will then leave this to rise for about an hour or till it's about doubled in size. The time it takes to rise may vary depending on the temperature in your house. So I would recommend, if you want to hurry up the process, try to leave it in a warmer area. Not in direct sunlight, but maybe I leave mine on top of the stove. I'm usually using the oven, so like the heat causes it to be one of the warmer areas in the house. Sometimes if I really need it to go a lot faster and it's wintertime, I will leave it near the fireplace. Now, after about an hour, my dough has puffed up nicely, so I'm just going to poke some holes in it, and you saw it got a little bubbly there. This means it's ready to work with, and it's nice and soft and ready to be shaped into final products. So here I'm just going to sprinkle the dough with flour and kind of form it into a rough circle so that I can separate it into 8 equal pieces. Now I know many people will actually use a scale so that they can weigh each one out and make sure that they're equal sizes. But for me, I actually like having sort of different sizes because my kids will tend to eat smaller naan than my husband and I. I'm forming each piece into a ball, and here I'll give you a better view of it. So I just lightly dust or get the flour to stick on top of it, and then I pinch all the sides into the center so that it becomes a lot tighter. I flip it over and I do a circular motion with my hand while my fingers rest on my countertop. I then push down on it and place it off to the side on a floured area so that it doesn't stick to my counter. I'll repeat this step 8 times until all of these balls are ready. The reason we make all these balls and sort of roll it within our hand is because it builds tension. This will allow little air pockets to form inside, and that's what will allow us to have little bubbles that rise up on our naan bread. My kids often like to either help me with this section or to just play with the flour that I have on the counter, and I have no problem with that. I like getting them involved in the cooking or dough making process. Once it is done, then you cover it with a tea towel or dish towel and let it rest for at least 15 minutes. During that time, I'm going to prep what I need for the naan after I cook it. So I have some garlic here that I'm just going to chop up. I'm going to mince it nice and fine because I don't want any large garlic chunks that could be, very overpowering. We will be brushing this onto the naan afterwards with some butter. I also have some fresh cilantro here that I'm chopping. This is optional. You don't have to put this on your naan if you don't like it, but I love the flavor of cilantro and so does my husband. But I won't put it on the naan that I make for my kids. Now I'm taking some butter here and I'm just quickly going to melt some butter in this bowl. I'll just put it in the microwave and I'm adding the garlic to it because warming up the garlic will sort of take some of that raw edge off of it. In the time that I prepared those elements, my dough balls rose up nicely, or they puffed up, and they are now ready to be rolled out and to be cooked. On the stove behind me, I actually have a large cast iron pan that I warmed up on medium heat. Sometimes you have to toggle a bit with the heat to make sure it's not too hot or not hot enough. I'm just gently rolling out this naan. I pick it up every so often so it doesn't stick to the countertop. I try to make it in these like long oval shapes just because I feel like that's more authentic, but really any shape will do. You want to roll it out relatively thin because when you do pick it up, it'll spring back a bit and shrink. And then you want to move quickly from picking it up to putting it into the pan because it's constantly trying to like pull back and shrink. So here's just a better view of this whole process. I gently roll out one side and then I roll it in the other direction, and it's just a continuous process. The more you do this, the more familiar you'll become with how to use your rolling pin so that the shape doesn't become all distorted. On to how we fry it in the pan. I just throw it in there relatively quick and I make sure it's nicely spread out. Here's a bit of a time lapse of it cooking in the pan. You'll see small bubbles start to form and the underside will get nicely browned. That means it's time to flip it over. Cook it for about another minute, and once it's done, I put it on parchment paper and just brush it with some of that butter and garlic mixture. This process becomes a little tedious and you're just going to repeat it 8 times. At this point, I start to have all my kids coming into the kitchen wanting to help, and also they're hungry, so they're waiting for dinner to be ready. I started making naan bread at home when I moved to this house because I no longer had access to good Indian restaurants, and I really enjoyed Indian food. I also hated to make a nice Indian meal with some, creamy, sweet and spicy butter chicken and not have any naan bread to dip in it. So I could not find a decent naan bread at the store, and therefore I decided I just might as well make it at home. The best part is to watch it puff up nicely, seeing those little bubbles rise. I find that the last couple naans that I make, they tend to be the best ones, probably because they've had more time to sit and relax. So here I'm actually adding some cilantro to the naan. So all I do is I put little pieces on top and then I'll just roll it into the dough. That will make it so that it won't just fall off of the dough and it will stick when I cook the naan. Cilantro is not a necessary ingredient though, so if you don't like it, you don't need to add it. Here are the final naans. They are soft, they're light, they're fluffy. They have those little burnt pieces from the bubbles that formed. And I can tell you that my family loves when I make this. My kids started eating some of them even before I served them, a plate. These rarely last more than one meal in my house. I normally use them to dip in things like butter chicken, but I will also sometimes make a wrap out of them. As you can see, they're super flexible. Of course, the most important test, though, is the taste test to make sure that they are salty enough and sweet enough and, just delicious. And I can guarantee that they were perfect, exactly what I wanted, exactly what I was craving on this day. I hope you give this recipe a try and let me know what you think. Enjoy!